In our past few segments, you've seen that LDS home life and congregational life may look very similar in many respects to mainstream Christian practices, but it's in the temple, above all else, where the very unique elements of the LDS worldview are most clearly seen. There are 190 temples worldwide, and at that time of this recording anyway, that number is increasing rapidly. There's 11 temples under construction right now as I speak. And so this temple building impulse illustrates how important temples are in LDS life. First of all, it's important to understand that Mormons consider their temples to be sacred. The LDS temple is not a gathering hall. It's not like a gathering place for the rank and file, but temples are required for saving ordinances that are seen as too sacred for the general public. And so not even every Mormon can enter the temple, but only those who prove worthy through an interview process. If they pass the interview process, then they receive what's called a temple recommend. It's an entry pass that's renewed every 2 years. And so the Next Mormon survey in 2016 reported how many Mormons have a temple recommend. And so the baby boomer generation, 1945 to about 1965-ish, 58% of baby boomers report that they have a current active temple recommend. The Generation X, 1965 through about 1980, 52% report that they have an active temple recommend. In the millennial generation, which is about 1980 to about 2000, 47% have an active temple recommend. Now this is important. The temple is so important. If you don't have access to the temple, there are certain things that you're excluded from in LDS life. For example, if one of your family members is going to be married in the temple, we'll talk about that in a minute, and you don't have a temple recommend, then you would not be able to attend that ceremony. Now, because of the sacred nature of the things that occur in the temple, LDS people don't talk about what goes on in there, even among themselves. They're very respectful toward the sanctity of the temple. And so while outsiders to the church might view temples as some kind of big veil of secrecy, LDS people would simply respond that the temples are sacred. Now, because of their high regard for the sanctity of the temple, LDS people are often easily offended when outsiders talk openly about what goes on there. It's a sign to them of disrespect. Now, we've talked about in a previous segment the local congregation or the ward. So let's compare for a moment the ward versus the temple. The ward is public, the temple is private. Everybody's welcome to attend the meetings of the ward, but only the most worthy, as we said, can enter the temple. The ward is a beehive of activity. There's things going on all the time. There's a hustle and bustle of activity around the ward, but the temple is a bastion of serenity. In fact, the celestial room is called, as at the end of the core temple ceremony is a beautiful place that's decorated to provide a peaceful, serene feeling, a place for meditation. The ward experience is all about how to live in this world. The temple experience is more about how to prepare for the world to come. Now let's talk a little bit about what happens in the temple. Of course, being sensitive to the sensitivities of LDS people, I'm not going to go into detail, but just a general sense. Now, Latter-day Saints will often try to draw a parallel between their temples and the biblical temple. But clearly, what happens in LDS temples has nothing to do with the things that happened in the Old Testament temple, where sacrifices were made to cover over people's sins. There's no animal sacrifices in the LDS temple, along with various other types of offerings that were made in the ancient temple. Those functions don't happen in the LDS temple, and the functions of the LDS temple, there's no record of those things happening in the old ancient temple of Jerusalem. Instead, LDS temples have three functions. Number one, they're a site for the ordinances that are required to gain access into heaven. So the main one that is in play here is the endowment and some related things related to that. The endowment involves a pictorial description of God's dealings with humanity, the history of salvation, a human's place within that grand panorama, and it gives a person esoteric information they will need to get through the veil or to pass the gates of heaven to be in God's presence. So that's number one. The second function is the temple is a site for ordinances to be performed that are required for families to be eternal. And so at the heart of this is the sealing ceremony or temple marriage. So Mormons believe that a temple can be for time and all eternity if it's solemnized in a temple. And so any kids that are born under that union later on, then they're also already sealed. They're born sealed to their parents for all eternity. But if you're a convert, you join the church, you were already married, then your family can also be sealed for eternity after you join the church and prove worthy of temple entrance. You can have that blessing as well. Now, young people growing up in the church are taught to set their hearts on having a temple marriage and doing what it takes to grow up to be worthy of that. If you're not married in the temple, there's sometimes a sense of stigma attached to that because people will wonder what you did wrong that you couldn't qualify for a temple recommend. Now, the third function is that the temple is the place where proxy ordinances are performed that are required to redeem the dead. And so that starts with proxy baptism. So in Mormonism, baptism is required for salvation, and there in the temple, people are baptized on behalf of their deceased relatives. So Latter-day Saints do genealogy to gather these names of people in order to do proxy ordinances for them. So then if you are baptized on behalf of one of your ancestors, then it's up to them. They have the opportunity in the spirit world to accept or to reject that ordinance. The same is true of the endowment. It can be performed on behalf of my ancestors, and I could go to the temple and do that work for them. And also the sealing, the eternal sealing of couples and their families for those who have passed away. And so after receiving their own ordinances, members are encouraged to return to the temple. The standard the culture suggests maybe once a month to do work for people who have passed away. Now, one interesting feature of the temple that a lot of people attracts their attention is the idea of the temple garment. Because once you receive the temple endowment, then you wear a special form of underclothing. And the purpose of this garment, as it's called, is a daily reminder of the covenants that you made in the temple. Now, in past generations, people viewed the temple garment as kind of a protective amulet, that it would protect you from physical harm. That view is declining in Mormonism. That's not official Mormonism, although people still often talk that way. But it's currently seen as a protection against temptation and against evil. And LDS people view the garment as sacred, as you can imagine, because of its association with the temple rites. And so it's not to be exposed to the uninitiated. It's not to be adjusted in order to accommodate contemporary fashion styles. And LDS people will be offended if the garment is ridiculed or if it's treated as just some common thing. So in summary, because the temple is restricted to the most worthy members, it creates kind of a church within a church, because the experience of Mormonism can be quite different for temple Mormons versus non-temple worthy Mormons. They'll have different experiences, different perspectives about things. Their faith is going to be shaped in different ways because of the temple experience or the lack thereof. And so typically, temple-worthy LDS people have a different level of seriousness about their faith because of the stringent requirements that they have to pass to have the temple recommend. And that's one reason the LDS Church urges its members to go to the temple, to become temple-worthy, to go there frequently, and to go there not only to do the ordinances that are performed there, but also the effect that it has on the loyalty and the activity of those members.